There are names that history remembers, and names it buries, across crumbling abbeys, forgotten castles, and blood-soaked ledgers locked in private vaults. 5 ancient houses left behind more than titles and heirs. They left signatures, not in ink but in blood. In an age when famine hollowed kingdoms and plague erased dynasties overnight, whispers spread of a covenant older than any crown. A promise made in candlelit chambers where crucifixes were turned to the wall. A pact sealed, not for wealth alone but for survival, dominion. And something far darker, they rose when others fell. Their banners never burned. Their bloodlines endured where entire empires collapsed into dust. Coincidence? Or a contract? Some chronicles speak of midnight envoys figures who arrived without footprints and departed without doors opening. Others hint at sealed archives marked only with a sigil, a circle broken by a single descending line. What did these houses truly trade, and why do their descendants still guard certain rooms that are never entered after dusk? Because the covenant was not temporary. It was generational. And some bargains do not expire. The world of the 5 houses shimmered with candlelight and illusion. From a distance, their castles rose like monuments to permanent stone towers piercing the sky, banners snapping in the wind, stained glass blazing with saints and martyrs. Inside, feasting halls overflowed with roasted meats, jeweled goblets, laughter echoing against vaulted ceilings blackened by centuries of smoke. But grandeur, in that age, was a costume worn over panic. Beyond the castle walls, the earth had begun to fail. Fields yielded thin harvests. Livestock collapsed in the mud, and villages clustered along frozen rivers. Mothers pressed silent infants to their chests, listening for breath that sometimes did not return. Famine moved slowly, like Fogan seen at first, then everywhere, and plague. Plague did not knock. It entered unannounced, threading itself through bloodlines as easily as it moved through alleyways. Thrones were inherited. Yezebut never secured. A single fever could erase 3 generations. A single betrayal could redraw borders overnight. Noble blood, once considered divine, had become dangerously fragile. The 5 houses understood this better than anyone. Their names were spoken with reverence in courts across the continent. They traced their ancestry to conquerors, saints, crusaders, martyrs. Their coats of arms were stitched into tapestries that depicted eternal dominion. Yet beneath those woven histories lay ledgers inked with debt, casualty lists, and unanswered prayers. One house had emptied its treasury funding a crusade that ended in humiliation. Its knights returned skeletal, its banners torn, its ships lost to storms that felt less like weather and more like warning. Creditors circled like vultures. Whispers in rival courts grew louder. Another house endured a winter so merciless it seemed designed. 3 heirs, 3 boys groomed since infancy succumbed to a fever that no physician could name. The family chapel filled with black veils. The patriarch aged 10 years in a single month. A 3rd house faced encirclement, not by armies alone, but by distant cousins with forged documents, ambitious. In foreign monarchs, suddenly discovering ancient ties of blood, legitimacy became a battlefield. The remaining 2 suffered quieter crises. Crops failed only on their lands. Trade routes shifted inexplicably. Promised alliances dissolved without explanation. It was as though something unseen pressed against them from every direction. Survival, in such times, demanded more than diplomacy. It demanded intervention. And this is where the pattern begins, not in public treaties, not in royal decrees, but in rooms that had no windows. Across different territories miles apart, separated by rivers and forests, and rival flags, each house recorded a similar entry within months of the others. A private gathering, not between the 5 houses, but within each, separately. The language is careful, almost evasive. The council was convened after sunset. The chamber was sealed. The advocate has been received. The advocate, no first name. No lineage, no heraldic symbol accompanying his presence. Just a title. Servants' logs from one estate mention an unfamiliar carriage arriving without escort. Stable boys noted that the horses bore no sigil. Gods recorded no gate entry. Yet wine was ordered. Candles were lit in the lower crypt. In another house's archive, a steward's account describes a cloaked figure escorted directly to the patriarch's study. The steward was dismissed before the door closed. He later wrote, in shaky script, the air felt altered, as before. No one documented the advocate's arrival. No one described his face. And yet, after each meeting, circumstances shifted. The crusading house found its creditors unexpectedly lenient. A rival claimant died suddenly of a riding accident on dry ground. Trade routes reopened. Gold flowed where none had before. The house that lost 3 heirs. A 4th son previously frail and overlooked recovered from an illness. Physicians deemed fatal. His constitution hardened. His mind sharpened. Within years, he consolidated lands his brothers had only dreamed of securing. The encircled house saw its rivals unravel. Documents proving claims were exposed as forgeries. Marriages arranged against them collapsed in scandal. Armies massed at their borders withdrew due to unexpected complications. Coincidence? Historians say fortune. Timing. But in private correspondences, letters never intended for public eyes phrases repeat. The terms are accepted. The lineage will continue. The cost is deferred. Deferred. The word appears again and again, as if written by different hands, but guided by the same ink. Deferred to whom? Deferred until when? It is here the transformation begins. Desperation had summoned the advocate. Relief secured his relevance. But relief, once tasted, is addictive. Within a generation, the sealed chamber ceased to be an emergency measure and became a scheduled rite. In one house, the patriarch descended alone into the family crypt. On the eve of every major political decision, candles arranged in a circle, a silver seal pressed into wax, no witness present. In another, a private oath was added to the coronation ceremony of heirs spoken not in the chapel, but afterward, in a small adjoining room accessible only through a narrow stone corridor. The oath was never recorded in official transcripts. Midnight became significant. So did silence. Servants were dismissed early on certain nights. Bells were removed from certain corridors. Tapestries were rearranged to conceal doors that did not appear on architectural plans. The advocate was not always seen, but he was expected. An expectation changes behavior. The 5 houses did not communicate openly about these rites. Rivalries still simmered. Alliances still shifted, yet their trajectories began to mirror one another. They did not fall. When plague returned, their estates reported fewer casualties. When wars ignited, their lands suffered minimal damage. When revolts spread through cities, their banners remained untouched. Survival turned to dominance. Dominance turned to influence. And influence, in time, became untouchable. But power acquired through unnatural symmetry carries weight. In diaries preserved by chance rather than intention, we find fragments of doubt. One matriarch wrote, "We are preserved, not spared." Another patriarch confessed in a sealed testament, "There are rooms in this house that do not feel ours." Children born into these houses grew up with rules they did not question. Never enter the West Wing after dusk. Never disturb the sealed ledger. Never speak the word advocate outside the inner chamber. Patterns solidified. The covenant, once whispered, hardened into doctrine. It was taught without being explained, enforced without being described, and always the language of deferral persisted. A cost postponed is not a cost erased. Across generations, portraits accumulated along gallery walls, oil-painted faces with steady gazes. But observers have noted something peculiar in reproductions of these works. In several, a faint silhouette stands behind the subject barely visible. Not detailed enough to identify, just a vertical suggestion, a shadow slightly darker than the rest. Restorers claim it is varnish aging unevenly. Archivists call it artistic flourish. Yet the placement is consistent, behind the patriarch, near the eldest son. close to the heart. Circles appear in marginalia as well, small, broken rings drawn beside signatures and private ledgers. Always the same design, a near-perfect circle interrupted by a single descending line, a symbol without official explanation. A mark of acknowledgement, or ownership. By the end of the 1st century after the advocates' recorded visits, the 5 houses stood stronger than ever. Their bloodlines continued. Their influence expanded, their enemies diminished, and their silence deepened, because prosperity born of pact demands maintenance, and maintenance requires obedience. The covenant was no longer a desperate measure taken in crisis. It was identity. It was inheritance. It was expectation. In halls where music played and goblets clashed, beneath laughter and gilded ceilings, a different understanding pulsed quietly through the lineage. We endured because we agreed. Agreed to what precisely is a question history cannot answer, or will not. The sealed chambers remain sealed. The private oaths remain unrecorded. The advocate's name remains unwritten, but the pattern across 5 separate houses, in separate lands, in separate decades remains. Too precise to dismiss. Desperation. Summoning. Acceptance. Prosperity. Deferral. And beneath it all, the sense that something was not eliminated, only postponed. The cost, after all, was deferred. And in every covenant, there comes a moment when deferral ends. Prosperity followed, but never without omen. The 5 houses rose with a steadiness that defied the violence of their age. Kingdoms fractured, borders shifted like sand under wind. Dynasties collapsed under the weight of debt and disease, and yet these houses endured, their influence expanding as though guided by a hand unseen. But prosperity, when it arrives too precisely, carries a shadow. The first house secured its ascendancy through a marriage so advantageous that courtiers called it Providence. The bride arrived from a distant principality rich in iron and fertile valleys, her dowry vast enough to silence every creditor. The union ended decades of territorial dispute overnight. Armies that had once gathered along contested borders withdrew without protest. Priests praised the alliance as divinely arranged. The wedding was extravagant. Bells rang for hours. Gold-threaded banners fluttered from parapets. Chroniclers recorded the event as the turning point in the house's fortune. Yet within a generation, something subtle began to unsettle those who paid attention. Portraits commissioned of the firstborn children from that union reveal a detail easily overlooked. Just above the heart, beneath pale skin, a faint crescent-shaped mark. It appears in painting after painting, a curved shadow like a sliver of moon pressed into flesh. At first, it was dismissed. Birthmarks are common. Patterns emerge where none are intended. But the crescent did not fade with age. It deepened in tone during adolescence, as though inked from beneath the skin. Physicians attributed it to hereditary pigmentation. They wrote lengthy explanations in medical journals, careful to avoid speculation. Midwives were less clinical. Several resigned after witnessing successive births. One left behind a single line in her personal notebook. It was there before the child cried. By the 4th generation, the crescent had become an unspoken certainty. The eldest child would bear it. Always over the heart, always identical in curvature, and always on the air. The second house flourished differently. Their strength was not territorial, but maritime. Trade routes stretched from northern ports to distant continents. Their ships returned heavy with spices, silks, precious stones. When storms swallowed entire fleets, their vessels emerged intact, sails torn but hulls unbroken. Insurance rates for their fleet were inexplicably low. Investors called them blessed, but sailors, remember. Whispers began in taverns along the docks. Crews described a shadow beneath the waterline, visible only during certain nights when the sea lay unnaturally still. It kept pace with the flagship no matter the speed. It did not resemble a whale or known creature. It was elongated, angular, constant. One captain recorded in a private log that during a violent squall and lightning fractured the sky and waves rose like walls, the shadow remained steady beneath them, cutting through water as if the storm did not exist. Other ships, traveling alongside, capsized. Theirs did not. When questioned, the house dismissed such accounts as superstition born of exhaustion, yet they quietly rotated crews more frequently than their competitors. Sailors who spoke too vividly of what they had seen were never rehired. Still, the fleet returned. Always returned. The third house wielded influence, not through land or sea, but through politics. For over a century, they did not lose a significant conflict. Rivals who challenged their authority found themselves undone in ways too intricate to trace. A claimant discovered incriminating letters planted within his chambers. A minister fell into sudden madness days before presenting charges. A general died of an aneurysm on the eve of exposing corruption. It was as if opposition dissolved before solidifying. Yet, within the house itself, a different pattern emerged. Heirs began reporting dreams. Not nightmares, precisely, but recurring visions of a corridor stretching into darkness. The floor made of stone cold enough to feel through bare feet. Along the walls, doors dozens of them each identical, each locked from the outside with iron bolts. The heirs did not open the doors. They simply walked past them. In every account, the corridor curved slightly to the left before vanishing into shadow. These dreams began around adolescence. They intensified before coronations or major political decisions. Some heirs described hearing whispers from behind the doors, distinct but urgent. Others claimed the corridor felt familiar, as though they had walked it before birth. Clergy were consulted discreetly. Exorcisms were considered, but never performed. The dreams were not discussed publicly. Instead, they were recorded in the sealed ledger. The ledger. Each house maintained one, bound in leather darkened by age, stored within a chamber accessible only to the eldest living member of the bloodline. Its pages contained no financial accounts, no genealogy. Instead, it documented rights. By the third generation after the advocate's arrival, the covenant had evolved into custom. On the eve of coronations, the heir descended alone into a subterranean chamber, lit by a single oil lamp. A circle was traced upon the stone floor, not painted, not carved, but formed by placing objects inherited across generations, a signet rin. A fragment of bone said to belong to a founder, a coin minted the year of the covenant. At midnight, a vow was spoken. Not loudly, not dramatically. Simply stated, the promise continues. Over newborn cradles, the same phrase was whispered by the patriarch, or mate. Infants too young to understand were marked with oil across the forehead and chest. If the crescent appeared, it was acknowledged with silence. If it did not, relief flickered briefly. Because relief, in these houses, was temporary. Power deepened across all 5 lineages. Their estates expanded. Their influence touched courts and parliaments. They financed wars without risking loss. They shaped treaties without public credit. Yet unease grew quietly alongside prosperity. Servants vanished. At first, it was attributed to normal attrition. Domestic staff come and go, but patterns emerged. Disappearances occurred exclusively on nights when rites were performed. No bodies were found. No wages collected. In the first house, an entire wing of the estate was sealed after a footman claimed to hear footsteps echoing where no corridor existed. In the second, the chapel was rebuilt without windows, its stained glass replaced by stone. The explanation given was structural integrity. But parishioners noticed the absence of light. In the third house, bells were removed from certain doors. Hinges were oiled excessively. Sound became something to control. And always, the ledger was updated. Entries grew shorter over time. Less descriptive and more symbolic. Circles drawn beside names. Lines descending from margins. By the 5th generation, heirs no longer questioned the rights. They anticipated them. They felt incomplete without them. The covenant had shifted from transaction to inheritance. What had begun as desperation was now doctrine. Yet doctrine demands maintenance. In one chilling correspondence between 2 distant cousins, members of separate houses who married to consolidate, influence, there appears a phrase not seen before. The Advocate does not tolerate neglect. Neglect of what? Of ritual, of remembrance, or of payment, because the word deferred still lingered in private archives. Deferred costs accumulate, they do not dissolve. Across continents, the 5 houses thrived while others fell. Their symbols adorned universities, cathedrals, financial institutions. They funded art and scholarship, presenting themselves as pillars of civilization. But behind the pillars stood shadows. The crescent over the heart darkened slightly with each generation. The maritime shadow beneath the hoe grew more defined in sailors' recollections. The corridor dreams extended Cimmeri's reported doors beginning to rattle as they passed, and yet no door was opened. Not in waking life. The houses endured. They endured famine, war, revolution, reform. Their wealth adapted to changing eras. Their titles shifted from feudal to financial, from royal to corporate. Endurance became their defining trait, but endurance, it seemed, required attention. On certain nights, candles still burned in rooms without windows. Circles were still formed on stone floors. Vows were still whispered over cradles. The promise continues. What promise? And to whom? Power is rarely free. Protection rarely unconditional. The pattern that once saved them now bound them, because prosperity granted by covenant is not a gift. It is a lease, and leases, unlike blessings, expire unless renewed. By the close of the 2nd century since the Advocate's first recorded appearance, the 5 houses stood stronger than any rival. Their enemies were footnotes, their archives immaculate. But in private, behind sealed doors, maintenance intensified, and something patient, silent, and exacerbated. To ensure the terms were upheld, every covenant carries a clause rarely spoken aloud. It is not written in the bold script of promises. It does not appear in the illuminated margins of sacred vows. It waits in the silence after celebration, in the space between inheritance and consequence. By the 4th generation, the cost began to surface not as catastrophe, not as fire from the heavens or plague at the gate, but as pattern. In each of the 5 houses, there was always one child per generation marked unsuitable. The word appears in fragments of correspondence, never elaborated, never explained. Unsuitable for succession. Unsuitable for court. Unsuitable for presentation. Not dishonoured. Not publicly disgraced. Not exiled in scandal. Simply absent. Genealogical trees from these houses are immaculate, their lines drawn with deliberate precision. Firstborn. Secondborn. Marriages noted. Alliances documented. Yet in private drafts versions never meant for historians there are faint scratches where names once existed. Ink blotted, pages removed, margins trimmed. In one surviving family Bible, beneath a list of baptized children, a name is written lightly in pencil then, erased so forcefully. The page nearly tears. No explanation follows. Letters between distant relatives hint at arrangements. A carriage departing before dawn. A child escorted not by servants, but by a single trusted advisor. The destination is never specified, but funding records reveal something peculiar. Across rural landscapes, monasteries of modest renown received anonymous endowments large enough to sustain them for generations. Remote towers, structures of uncertain origin, were maintained despite housing no permanent staff. Guards rotated frequently. None remained longer than a month. One monastery ledger notes a special ward constructed beneath the main chapel. Its purpose unrecorded. A priest's private diary, discovered centuries later, contains a single unsettling entry. The confession was not of sin, but of nature. I was instructed to forget what I heard. I find I cannot. The priest died 3 days after writing it. Official cause: fever. Patterns do not need spectacle to inspire dread. They require repetition. And the repetition is exact, one child per generation. Removed quietly. Remembered only in fragments. As the generations advanced, the rites continued. Midnight circles. Whispered vows. The ledger updated in careful, measured script, but a subtle tension began to ripple through the houses. The heirs who remained grew more contemplative, more withdrawn. Portraits from this era show figures less triumphant, more guarded. Eyes shadowed, hands clasped tightly as though holding something invisible in place. Servants reported doors locking from the inside without touch. Chapel candles extinguishing simultaneously. Footsteps echoing in corridors long after midnight rites concluded. And then came the convergence. In the late 17th century, for the first time in documented history, representatives of all 5 houses gathered under a single roof. The location is debated. Some argue it was a fortress straddling contested borders. Others suggest a remote abbey, known for its isolation. The records that survive are incomplete, their margins trimmed as if edited by deliberate hand. What is known as this: invitations were sent in cipher. Travel was discreet. No public announcement accompanied the gathering. The official reason discussed in court correspondence was the negotiation of trade and mutual defense. But in a surviving ledger entry, penned in the hand of the eldest patriarch present, there are 3 words written apart from the rest. The advocate returns. Returns, not arrives. Returns. This suggests continuity, expectation. A presence not extinguished. Morelli absent. Accounts from servants who prepared the estate for the gathering describe unusual instructions. Windows shuttered, despite clear skies. Mirrors covered with dark cloth. Floors washed with salt water. A circular table positioned in a chamber normally unused. 5 chairs, and 1 more. No servant claims to have seen the 6th occupant. Yet one footman later recounted that the door to the chamber seemed to open inward on its own, though no hand touched it. The meeting lasted until dawn. No transcript survives, but the aftermath is measurable. Following that year, the fortunes of the 5 houses stabilized once more with uncanny precision. Wars erupted across the continent, yet their territories remained untouched by siege. Revolutions ignited, but their estates were bypassed. Monarchies fell, republics rose, empires fractured, their wealth adapted seamlessly. They transitioned from feudal lords to financiers, from hereditary rulers to architects of policy. They funded both sides of conflicts yet emerged unscathed, respectable, untouched. And yet something had changed. Birth rates declined sharply across all 5 houses within 2 generations of the convergence. Where once there were 3 or 4 children per patriarch, there was now often only 1. Heirs grew increasingly reclusive, educated privately, rarely seen in public festivities. Correspondence from tutors describes them as intelligent, disciplined, and burdened. The dreams intensified. The corridor appeared more frequently. The locked doors multiplied. Some heirs reported that as they walked, one door would tremble violently, as though something within demanded release. But still, no door was opened. The unsuitable child per generation continued to vanish. The anonymous endowments to secluded monasteries increased. One remote tower, long dismissed as architectural curiosity, was renovated extensively during this era. Windows bricked over, interior walls reinforced. No public explanation provided. In personal letters, one matriarch wrote to her sister, "We endure because we comply." The sentence is underlined twice. Comply with what? The covenant, once framed as protection, now resembled obligation. The ledger entries from this period grow sparse. Instead of descriptive accounts, symbols dominate. The broken circle appears more frequently. The descending line grows darker, pressed harder into parchment. Scholars who have studied these fragments suggest the symbol may represent continuity interrupted yet guided, a lineage broken but directed downward. Toward what? No one can say. By the 18th century, the 5 houses were no longer medieval relics, but modern power structures. Their names adorned banks, universities, philanthropic foundations. They funded exploration, industry, cultural movements. They appeared enlightened, progressive. But archives held under private authority tell a quieter story. In restricted vaults accessible only through legal channels, few Knavigat documents bear the same symbol etched faintly into the margins. The broken circle, the descending line, ambesidet, a phrase repeated in Latin and in older tongues. Promissum renovatur, the promise is renewed. Renewed. Not fulfilled. Not completed. Renewed. Which implies expiration, which implies recurrence. Today, the names of the five houses remain woven into financial institutions and political circles. Their influence feels institutional rather than feudal. Their histories are curated carefully, controversies smoothed into narrative arcs of resilience, respectable, untouched. But in certain estates now converted into museums or corporate retreats, there remain wings closed to the public, rooms without windows, chapels without glass, corridors that curve slightly to the left before vanishing into shadow. Maintenance continues. Though the advocate's name was never recorded, his presence lingers in structure and in silence. Every covenant carries a clause rarely spoken aloud, and every renewal suggests that whatever was deferred was never cancelled. The cost did not arrive as apocalypse. It arrived as pattern. One child per generation, one gathering per century, one symbol pressed into parchment. The covenant, it seems, was never broken, only renewed. And as long as the broken circle continues to be drawn, as long as heirs whisper vows over cradles and rooms without windows, the question remains, not whether the cost will come, but when the final renewal will be demanded, and who, at last, will be deemed unsuitable.